He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. Just a heads up, listeners, this episode contains some adult language.
Previously on The Agency.
We then came up with a very elaborate scheme, and it involved me being on an evaluation team in New Zealand to look to buy the F-16.
So what happens is, these people are recruited abroad, and then the ones that we think have the temperament come and work when they return to Moscow, they will work with us inside.
I went back to my hotel and had to sit down and think about this, and I thought, if they're coming for me, I won't even see it coming. It'll just happen and I won't even know. The Americans had kind of said, we're not going to leave you out there. But whether that's true or not, what could they do? What could they do? And if I was taken out, face down in the Pasig River in Manila or something, I had this perhaps naive feeling that they wouldn't leave me out there. They'd come for Kit. They'd save me. Was probably very naive. Because what could they do?
As Kit Bennetts moves towards the goal of his operation against Soviet military intelligence in the Philippines, he's been given the news that another CIA operative, this one in Europe, has been killed. And the similarities with what he's doing are alarming.
Same modus operandi, he's doing the same thing as me. With a GRU officer, same sort of point.
So his handler has given him the opportunity to press pause and take a step back.
I turned it over in my mind quite a lot. I didn't feel particularly brave then. On balance, I should have said, no, I'll go home and wait till it calms down and come back. But, and it didn't affect what I was doing. I had a couple of appointments and met Vladimir and things. But
the service didn't know?
No, and I never reported it, no. The Americans knew because they told me. And they were quite happy that I agreed to stay. And they didn't make a big thing about it. I think I might have made a bigger thing about it in my head. But, I never reported it to the service, never told anyone.
Now, Kit Bennetts, who's doing some pretty high-pressure risk assessment on his own here, has made the decision not to tell the SIS, who are, strictly speaking, still his employer, because he's worried they might be a bit strict on the health and safety guidelines around this operation.
Yeah, he's come a long way to get to where he is, and he doesn't want to have to turn back now.
So he's going to be economical in what he discloses to his bosses back in New Zealand.
I certainly didn't report that particular thing because I was frightened if I did. They'd say, right, that's enough, you're coming back.
You were frightened that they'd
pull the pin. Yeah, they never reported that to them.
From Bird of Paradise Productions and RNZ, this is The Agency. I'm Guyan Espiner.
And I'm John Daniel. This is episode 4, Arranging the Truth.
This episode is going to take us into the heart of a very audacious lie.
And for that lie to work, it's going to need to look like the truth.
But before we get there, we're going to look at how the lines around the truth are sometimes blurred, especially in the world of espionage.
Yet whenever we tell a story, even to ourselves, we make choices about how we use information. If you're a spy working in the knowledge you might get knocked off at any moment, you might tell yourself CIA has your back, even when you know that can't be true.
It might just be what you need to get your job done. And if you've decided what you're going to do is important and you don't want anyone to stop you, you might choose not to tell your employer that you're running into potential danger.
The language we use, the details we put in, the ones we leave out, and how we frame them all up make a difference to how the story we're telling is perceived by the person listening to it.
I want to remind you and all your listeners that, as I like to brag, I basically ended the Cold War in New Zealand, and all of your listeners, and you included, probably owe me a drink.
This is Professor Rouben Azizian. These days he's an academic, but in 1991 he had another job.
I was the acting Soviet ambassador. I was the one who lowered the hammer and sickle flag over the famous Kremlin Soviet embassy building in Karori. So once I do that, New Zealand formally is not in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and there's no Soviet presence officially there.
But the Soviet Union straight away, the Soviet Union embassy straight away became the Russian embassy, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So at that point, Rouben Azizian became the Russian ambassador. And it's in that capacity as a former ambassador for both countries that we spoke with him in our previous series, The Service.
Yeah, we did. And he is a respected media commentator, and you can tell he hasn't lost that diplomatic ability to soften up the person he's talking to by saying something nice. So,
and I have to start with maybe a diplomat in me always to compliment you and John for your terrific work, because honestly, as I was telling John, I give many interviews. People always remind me of your program. You were with Geon Espiner and Cold War, and then this is one, and Jack Tame number 2. So I won't tell Jack he's number 2.
Don't worry. Well, Guyan will.
I'll pass that on to Jack. Because we're running buddies.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the second time we've mentioned TVNZ. That's probably enough free cross-promotion, isn't it?
Number 2, though, Jack, that's very creditable.
Now, we wanted to talk to Rouben Azizian about the Soviet Union and modern Russia and his perspective on New Zealand's membership of the Five Eyes. And we're going to hear from him on all that. But when we spoke to him in November of 2025, he'd just come back from visiting Armenia, the country where he was born, although he says it's a bit complicated.
The country that I was born in was called USSR, Soviet Union, right? And Armenia was only part of that country.
Yeah, this is going to feel like a bit of a walk, but stick with us. It's important because Armenia, formerly part of the Soviet Union, has been on the wrong end of some brutal geopolitical calculations, and it continues to be the victim of realpolitik, even from our own government here in New Zealand.
Perhaps the best known is what's commonly referred to as the Armenian Genocide. Beginning in 1915, Armenia's neighbours, the declining Ottoman Empire, modern-day Turkey, they oversee the deaths of 1.5 million Armenians, 3/4 of the population.
While the US and Russia and Europe and dozens of other countries call this a genocide, Turkey denies it, pushing back very strongly against the word. The Turks say the death toll is exaggerated and that people died because of things like disease or bad weather and perhaps a few bad apples in far-flung outposts of a ramshackle administration.
Yeah, now, if that feels a little bit thin as an explanation, the New Zealand government, and it's worth mentioning the Australian one too, have both gone along with some version of it for decades now. We refuse to say it was a genocide, seemingly because to do so would annoy Turkey, which would mean we would be in danger of losing access to the commemorative sites at Gallipoli that have become so important to our national memory.
Yeah, and look, either way, you make these calls based on national interest. So you can't say that's wrong.
No, we're not saying it's right either.
No, just that foreign affairs often involves murky trade-offs and moral compromise. Historically, our geographical isolation has kept us relatively safe from invasion. But the reality is that small countries need alliances, and those allies aren't necessarily going to be perfect. And let's face it, no one, including us, will always be on the right side of history.
Yeah, often you're looking at a series of fairly unpleasant choices where you just have to be pragmatic. That's something Armenia is currently having to reckon with after a militarised land grab of Armenian territory by their neighbours, where their old ally Russia didn't come to the rescue.
Russia didn't really do much. Being a security ally, Russia let it go. As a result, Armenia lost that Nagorno-Karabakh region populated by Armenians. There is no single Armenian left there.
So the Armenians have left behind Russia to realign with their former oppressors.
That has accelerated Armenia's movement away from Russian influence towards Europe, even re-establishing ties with Turkey and Azerbaijan, which is very challenging. Armenians living overseas, diaspora, still have very hostile memories of Turkey. But Armenia needs friendly neighbors. Armenia needs to end this war, and Armenia needs to get out of that one-sided dependence on Russia.
Here in New Zealand, so far from these conflict zones, it can be hard to grasp the reality that other countries live with.
In fact, we spoke with Rouben Azizian in Wellington as he finished up teaching New Zealand Defence Force personnel as they got ready for overseas deployments.
I'm here for a course we ran for some of our defense officials who will be appointed as defense attachés in various countries. And one of the important things is to understand cultural differences and cultural motivations.
It's important to understand what makes people tick, whether you're working with them or against them.
He was taller than me, but that's no great achievement. 90% of the population are taller than me. But he was sort of medium height, medium build, slim build. He had fair hair, reasonably fair hair, and mousy sort of fair hair.
This is Kit Bennetts describing his target from Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, the guy we're calling Vladimir.
Quite a good-looking man and a very good-looking wife. His wife was quite gorgeous with the high Slavic cheekbones and blonde hair. She was lovely too. She was lovely.
About your age?
A little older, I think. Yeah, early to mid 30s. He wouldn't have been much older than me. He had 2 children, and he was telling me about going away on home leave. And the way that it worked, no matter whether they were intelligence officers or not, they were very rarely allowed to be in the West with all their children.
In 1985, the British singer-songwriter Sting had a hit song called Russians. You might remember it, John. You might sing it, please don't.
Was around.
Now, technically, it should have probably been called Soviets, but you get the gist, and I don't want to be too pedantic. It revolved around the idea that Sting hopes the Russians love their children because then surely there won't be a nuclear war.
That's right. I was only 13, but it was actually a kind of genuine question. Do they love their children? Because from a distance, we perceive them as being incredibly hard-hearted, stony-faced brutes, intent on destroying us and our freedom. So it was kind of hard to picture them as having much time for kids. But of course they love their children. If anything, in a society that often lacked material comforts and that was so tightly controlled it would have been hard to know who to trust, children must have been a straightforward joy.
And I remember his wife was not enjoying the Philippines, and it was not because she didn't like the posting or what they were doing, but she didn't have the kids with them. And they were little kids, 7 and 8, it was terrible. But I remember one occasion, he'd been away on home leave, he and his wife, and had a lovely time. That was when he bought me the Matryoshka doll. They'd been on home leave, and he said that she had a great, what was her name? I can't remember. Anyway, she was so happy, but he said it was all because she was with the children, and it was so hard for her to come back.
In overseas postings, the Soviet authorities appear to have used children as leverage to ensure loyalty, even people in trusted positions.
They were well paid. These were top jobs these people had, whether they be... And same for the diplomats, not just the intelligence officers, but often even particularly the diplomats. They weren't allowed to have their families... And that's not... They didn't hold to that strictly. Sometimes they'd have the whole family together, but not for very long. And of course, the Americans and Brits would always be watching for that because... when they have got their family together, suddenly some guy might come out and say, hey, I want to stay, and they know nothing. And that's happened where they didn't know anything about the guy. He was a Time magazine recruit, or, he'd decided to jump but wasn't going to talk to anyone until he had his family with him. So the Soviets were very careful about that.
Even though Vladimir has asked Kit Bennetts to procure some quite sensitive information and technology, it's always going to be a possibility that something unexpected, like an approach on how to get to New Zealand, could happen, because they're so close now.
Every time I got there, I'd know he was there because the station would tell me, he's not on home leave or anything, so I'd make sure I was there when he was there. And I'd ring him up, and he was always happy to come and see me, sometimes pick me up in the hotel, and we'd go and have lunch. Sometimes we'd have lunch in the hotel, and there'd be long lunches.
And what were you
Brandy.
talking about over there? What was the sort of the subterfuge, or what was the...
Well,
what were you...
always about business, and he'd be asking me about living in New Zealand and that sort of thing, and my travels, and I'll be asking him about where he'd been based and what sort of business he was doing, because he was in the commercial side.
So his cover, right? So
His cover was a commercial cover.
In principle, it looked like two mates
Yeah.
who'd been out drinking
Yeah.
at various points and were just catching up
Yeah.
because they might be able to help
Yeah.
with a bit of business, but also just, enjoyed each other's company. And
And I was recruiting him. Meanwhile, he was looking to recruit me.
So one of the many strange things about this dance is how much there is riding on the lie that Kit Bennetts is a businessman.
Yeah, I mean, very banal sounding details can have an outsized importance here. They could even be the difference between life and death. So while he's keeping one eye on the prize, he has to be very diligent about making this deception sound like the truth.
More important was building my commercial cover and learning what I had to know about business. I mean, because I had to understand about exporting, had to understand about what, for example, if I'm in, let's say I was in any Southeast Asian country, say Thailand, and I say I'm exporting something here or I'm buying something here, I need to know what the rules are with regard to tariffs and import restrictions and things like that, because I might well be dealing with a Soviet or East European who's a commercial expert. So he's going to see through me. So I had to do my homework, and that was, yeah. I handed on an economic survey on, I can't remember what it was now. I didn't write it. It got written, AI would write it nowadays, but it got written by people in Langley, and I handed it off as my work to Vladimir. Now, this is just a paper I did for a research paper I did for somebody or something. And that was kind of just, it was nothing classified. It was just tantalising. Looked like I knew a hell of a lot more than I did. I read it and didn't understand it, but I handed it on, and it was, yeah. But building my commercial cover was the hardest part.
At the back of Kit Bennett's mind is the constant concern that his past might come back to haunt him. His involvement in the Such case in Wellington in 1975 was publicised at the time, remember, against the wishes of the SIS. Maybe that would be on a file somewhere.
At some stage in that, they might have worked out what I was. And I all the time was puzzled that they have to know, the KGB know my name, surely they'd tell the GRU.
Our understanding is that the GRU did not have a presence in New Zealand at the time of the Such trial. So it makes sense that this cover, even using his real name, would hold with the GRU.
One of the reasons why they didn't want me too much with the KGB is that they felt once they started name-checking me and things, I'd come up in lights.
Yeah, I mean, the GRU and the KGB are supposed to be on the same side, but they're also rivals and competitors, so probably not given to cross-checking every contact with someone from the West in case they give away some leverage or other. So Kit Bennetts keeps riding his luck, and eventually he's going to be able to fall back on something he does know, something that is going to really interest Soviet military intelligence.
After numerous meetings, around the time he discovers that another CIA operative has been killed during an operation against the GRU, Kit Bennetts and his handler start to push towards an endgame involving warplanes.
So I've got a photograph of me standing beside a Skyhawk, all done up in flying gear and G-suit and everything. And I showed it to Vladimir. I said, yes, this is one from the old days. This is all rubbish, but, and I showed him. He said, what a great photo. It's a good photo. Can I have this photo? And I said, yeah, sure you can, whatever, I thought, well, that'll be on my GRU file. It's probably still there. I thought it was funny. Every time I look at that photo, I think, oh, yes. No, the neat thing about this is on my file in Moscow. But, yeah.
But before he's come up with this seemingly chance photo, in amongst some other snaps of his wife and whatever he's been up to lately, weeks and months of work have been put into his backstory through CIA liaison with the SIS and then through the Royal New Zealand Air Force, who had taken Kit Bennetts up in the A4 Skyhawk, an attack aircraft with guns, missiles, rockets, even capable of carrying nuclear bombs. All this so his cover would sound legit.
I went up a few times in the aeroplane and flew it, and I flew the Strike Master a few times too, with friends of mine that were flying. But I went on a kind of an attachment to the squadron to make sure that I understood about strike operations. And so I went out on lots of on things, refuelling, strikes up on the, mock strikes and things like that. So I spent some time in the aeroplane.
This is it. This is what really interests me, is the sense of, so this is this massive, deep background that
Yes.
you have to do in order to be able to have, at that moment of contact,
Yeah. Credibility. Yeah.
And so there's a but something comes up in conversation about something or other, and you can answer honestly and knowledgeably.
And look, probably after the third brandy, he might have said to me, so what are these things like to fly? I've got to be able to say what they like to fly. What happens if you have an engine failure shortly after takeoff? If you're under 150 knots, you punch out. If you whatever, I can't remember any of it now, but I did have it all in there then. So,
Because to
deep
fail
fail
is to be found out, isn't
That's
it?
right, yeah.
Instantaneously,
Yeah.
really, isn't it?
Yeah, so that was good, and that worked very well.
While the RNZAF Combat Wing was disbanded in 2001, back in the mid-1980s, 75 Squadron, running the A4 Skyhawk, was headquartered just outside the small town of Bulls.
Yeah, that's Ohakia Air Base, about, half an hour or so west of Palmerston North.
Ohakia, yeah. And a couple of officers up there, who I shan't name, were really great at doing that. The Chief of Air Staff had agreed to it, and it was all on a nod. I don't think anything was ever written down. 2 officers at Ohakia knew that. The rest of them just knew me because I used to go up, and I was an officer in the cadet forces, so I used to go up and run the commissioning courses for the adults that did it. So people on base knew me, so the guys on 75 Squadron all knew me, so they didn't think it was unusual that I was there. And they actually called on me once before this it was a triad exercise, and they were short of officers, and they wanted an intelligence officer to go. So I went up and worked on that. So some of them knew I was in the service, but they didn't know what the rest of this was about. They didn't know anything about me working overseas, nothing about the agency, didn't know that I actually ran a business. It was all compartmentalised. So we were able to do that.
They allowed you to actually fly, or
there's always someone with me.
Sure,
yeah.
But you were in the A4s.
Oh yeah.
They allowed you to do that so that your cover would be good enough.
Yes.
To do this.
Yeah.
That's extraordinary, isn't it?
In fact, all of this is designed to get Kit Bennetts to a point where he can quietly, ever so discreetly, allow Vladimir to discover that he's on a Royal New Zealand Air Force committee evaluating the possibility of buying F-16s, a more up-to-date combat aircraft than the A4 Skyhawk.
New Zealand did look at the F-16s, but that was much later. But yeah, there was talk about it then. But at this time, we were talking about replacements for the A4, and so it worked.
It's that layer upon layer of subterfuge and deception, or the building of a really good cover.
Water on limestone stuff, isn't it?
It's a long game. You got to play a long game. It hasn't changed since they were wheeling horses into Troy. The intelligence work goes on and on. But
One of the recent CIA success stories has come in Ukraine. This is an ABC News story from January 2025.
Tonight on Prime, the remarkable story of how the CIA and Ukrainian intelligence forged a deep secret partnership that began a decade ago and has been crucial in helping Ukraine defend itself against Russia's invasion.
Ukrainian intelligence officials say that not only did the CIA give them warning of the imminent invasion, troops they had trained were on the front lines and able to push back against the invaders.
All these guys were the first line of our defense, which meet Russian in the first day of invasion.
Following the invasion, many restrictions on CIA operations were lifted. Ukrainian officials say without the intelligence support, Ukraine could not have held off Russia.
While we understand that Ukraine and Russia have been in this hot war since 2022, what's less obvious is that Europe is now in conflict with Russia. Now, this is driven largely by what are described as grey zone attacks from Russia. Not direct attacks that kill people, but things like unidentified drones over airports, the destruction of undersea cables, sabotage of rail lines, that kind of crucial infrastructure.
Grey zone attacks are deliberately kept below the threshold of the kind of thing that would lead to a flat-out declaration of war and an escalation of conflict that could be hard to stop. Just to keep it hard to understand, Russia typically refuses to acknowledge responsibility. But there has been a ramping up of grey zone warfare over the last few years that makes you wonder whether we haven't moved from a kind of Cold War into a hot one.
And so we asked Professor Azizian if he thinks there is actually an unannounced hot war going on between Europe and Russia.
Yes, there is. I mean, we can always argue about definitions, and some people think that we are not in World War III, but depends how you define World War III. We could very well define what's happening as a World War III.
Professor Azizian was then pointing to the way countries are lining up on either side of the Ukraine-Russia war as an indication of how the battle lines are drawn, as I say, back in November 2025.
Look, we have 50 or so coalition partners of Ukraine, including New Zealand, supporting Ukraine and doing military and other support. We have basically North Korea and Iran very much aligned to Russian interests, and China basically being sympathetic at least. So there are all the features of a Third World War. For some reason, we are careful not to call it that.
And you can see why. And remember, what the intelligence agencies are doing here is often referred to as political warfare. And while what is happening in Ukraine is definitely a hot war, the one that's playing out across Europe is in this grey zone where intelligence agencies operate as they did back in the Cold War.
Yeah, so they're working on containment of their adversaries. Intelligence and counterintelligence, they're probing the opposition, trying to get an advantage without resorting to the kind of weaponry that would escalate the situation.
There is hesitancy to provide, long-range missiles. So there's a restrained support for Ukraine, and that makes it a little bit uneven in terms of a full war, in my opinion, is when both countries contribute equally in terms of their enthusiasm and ambition. Here we see, I think, Europe and US, being involved and supporting, but to a degree. Of course, people will say, come on, Rouben, we don't want to escalate. We don't want to make it a full Third World War, which they mean by the use of nuclear weapons. I think that's the difference. So we are worried that Russia will use nuclear weapons. That's a different question. Frankly, I don't want to make any predictions because I got it wrong in 2022 when, like many, I'm afraid, I didn't expect a full invasion by Russia of Ukraine. That happened. So we can't say that will never happen. But in my view, that will be almost a suicidal decision by Mr. Putin. And to answer an earlier question by Guillaume, the end game of Putin is not to commit a suicide.
All right, we'll come back to this, to Rouben Azizian and Vladimir Putin's Russia and the America of Donald Trump, and what that all means for the Five Eyes alliance, where New Zealand sits alongside its major security partner.
Yeah, this kind of moment in Ukraine and across Europe is a pretty useful reminder of the stakes involved in these more intimate spy games. If Kit Bennetts can manoeuvre Vladimir into the right spot, there could be a payoff for the US and the West more generally in this Cold War that through the 1980s is still pretty hot.
Remember, Kit Bennetts and CIA are now aiming to pass on dead-end technology to Soviet military intelligence. While it isn't necessarily a well-known technique, he says it's been around for a long time.
There's an Agatha Christie story on that. So done in the 30s where they, the story had them getting technology to the Germans that was dead-end technology. So this is not new, probably been tried in intelligence services all over. But that's what we were looking to do. And the way we did that was that sometimes in an operation you take it to a certain point and then you're cut out of it and someone else comes in. And that can be deeply frustrating because you then are cut out and the need to know arises, you don't know what happened. You don't know. And that was the case with this.
So, having carefully crafted a deception around his level of expertise as a pilot, Kit Bennetts and the CIA determined that the most credible next step is to use this story to get in a new man with ties to the US military.
And I was on this non-existent evaluation team that the New Zealand government had set up, and I was the reserve officer on that. And they were clamouring for this. I've got this I got this mate that I met there. Actually, he is. I'm hoping to meet him next time I'm out because he's doing some work with Clark or something, and I piggybacked him in, and then he was going to be passing. He was theoretically an a guidance system guy.
This new man will offer fresh possibilities for the GRU.
Yeah, we're never told exactly what the dead-end technology was, because Kit Bennetts wasn't told. He didn't need to know that technical aspect of the story.
Which must be pretty frustrating, but given we know this new American man was posing as an expert in missile guidance and weaponry, you would imagine it's something along those lines. Those really meaty mechanical details that interest the Soviets, either to be able to counteract the weapons or to copy them.
You say you know something about this, but really this is the time for you to...
Yeah, one of the guys that I was working with, really great American guy, and he's coming through here because we were talking the other day. You must meet him, and he was on the design team of the F-16, and he's a good guy and pretty easygoing, that sort of thing.
But doesn't that scream,
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like...
Yeah.
Why would he be so... Why would your men...
Why would
happen to have been on the F-16 design team...
Come to Manila
to chat openly with...
He was going up to Clark Air Base to do something, or Subic Bay or something to do something.
Now, you can hear that I'm exhibiting a certain amount of scepticism. We'll come back to this in a second. Kit Bennetts understands why.
The part that should have had them concerned was that now we're dealing with an American who's dealing with guidance systems. It all has top secret stamp top and bottom. And here's a Russian diplomat. It's an ask. But these things happened. And remember, I was talking about the frog kissing that they would do, saying to guys with Russian names, and CIA would, we want you to come home. We need you to work for us.
Okay, so this is something he mentioned separately. The idea that the KGB were kissing a lot of frogs in the hope that one of them might turn into a prince. In this case, Soviet intelligence had approached a number of intelligence officers and diplomats of Russian heritage and pitched them to come over and work for the land of their fathers.
And, you get a lot of knockbacks, but, you never know. You just might get lucky. And so they thought, well, what have we got to lose?
So this is the parallel he's drawing with the operation against Vladimir and the GRU.
What have we got to lose talking to this guy? That's how I think they would have viewed it. If it got triggered or sprung or didn't work, the Philippine government was in turmoil. They weren't going to be doing anything.
So effectively, what Kit Bennetts is saying is that, yes, the GRU aren't fools. They know if something looks too good to be true.
Like, a friendly New Zealander who just happens to offer them an introduction to an American missile guidance expert?
Yeah, something crazy like that. Then, while it probably is too good to be true, they can't afford not to follow it up. And in any case, there's no downside. And he says the bait wasn't presented as clumsily as it might sound.
There's a series of, very distantly spaced breadcrumbs.
Yes.
Rather than like a massive sandwich.
Exactly.
Why don't you have that guy?
Yes. Come and meet this F-16 designer. He's coming to Manila. Yeah, it was not like that. Yeah. It was done over a period of time.
But what, you don't think that's the full story, do you?
All right. This is kind of the crux of everything we've been talking about, so let's take a moment and get into it. Now, one thing we haven't said is that we have a second source for almost all of what Kit Bennetts has told us so far.
Yeah, I suppose it's always theoretically possible that we are the victims of an elaborate influence operation run by anyone from the SIS to the GRU. This is the wilderness of mirrors, after all, but we're as confident as we can reasonably be in this story. And your family background, John, and your knowledge of Kit Bennetts and his work, that goes a long way too, right?
Yeah, they play a long game, but that would be like decades on an off chance that I get into making podcasts.
And this second source, it's backed up pretty much everything until now.
That's right. Wherever it's been possible to cross-check, Kit and the second source have concurred, except in one area, money.
Yeah, Kit Bennetts has told us that money was not a factor in the relationship with Vladimir. Even when it came to the shopping list we told you about, that Vladimir was only covering his expenses rather than compensating him for the risks he was starting to run by bringing in sensitive material.
I didn't say to him, yeah, well, I can get that stuff for you, but, I need dead presidents. I'm taking some risks here. So we never got to that point.
But the second source says that isn't right. In fact, Kit Bennetts, on the instructions of his CIA handler, began relatively early to make the move into a transactional relationship, pushing for money to change hands, and that this was a deliberate ploy to increase his credibility as a source of good material.
Yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, they might get on well, but not well enough to be going out of your way to get into danger. I mean, you need a real motive for that.
Yeah, totally. And the second source makes the point that, in fact, Vladimir repeatedly asked Kit Bennetts about his finances because that was seen as an obvious thing they could offer him. And we put that to Kit Bennetts, and he agreed that he must have misremembered this angle. And in fairness, it is 40 years ago, and he could easily have forgotten this because, in any case, he couldn't keep the money. He couldn't keep any money because while the Americans funded his expenses generously, they always took any of the cash his businesses brought in.
Like the sheepskin coats. He says they sold quite a few of them, but never kept a cent.
It's always a problem with the Americans. If you make money, what the hell do we do with the money? You know, if I make money in the business, what do you do with it?
What did you do with it?
Uncle Sam kept it.
So if Uncle Sam kept it, you can see why he wouldn't necessarily remember any money coming in 40 years later. Because for Kit Bennetts, this relationship with Vladimir is built on trust and friendship. The money is just from one government to another.
And if you're quietly thinking he might have held on to the money and kept quiet about it for 40 years, that's highly unlikely for another reason that is also confirmed by the second source. All the meetings with Vladimir were recorded.
Yeah, I had a sophisticated system of recording. It was sophisticated for those days. It was very sexy for those days.
What sort of kit are you talking about? Like something hidden in a room or...?
No, hidden with me. Yeah,
on your person?
Not on my person, on just in my, I had a briefcase. And I had a briefcase that I carried up through customs and I carried it back through customs, but it wasn't in that briefcase. It was in an identical briefcase that I picked up when I arrived.
So you weren't wearing a wire?
No, I wasn't wearing a wire. No.
OK, so you're thinking that it's more likely Kit Bennetts has told Vladimir that he can get access to this weapons expert for money.
Yeah, look, it fits the pattern of what had been going on until now. The Soviets had been doing exactly this kind of thing for years, using Russian intelligence officers attached to embassies to build up a network of dozens of agents embedded in Western companies specialising in high-end engineering.
And stealing the tech.
Exactly, but in the early 1980s, a KGB colonel, Vladimir Vetrov, codenamed Farewell, had passed on their names to French intelligence via an ordinary French businessman who travelled to Moscow for work. This became known as the Farewell Affair. The French made a film about it.
The men and women of the free world owe you a lot, Mr. Fremont.
That's Willem Dafoe playing a CIA officer. CIA got these files from the French in late 1981. Most of the people working for the Russians were arrested, but in some cases, they were used to feed disinformation back to the KGB. We mentioned the failure of the Soviet space shuttle program in the last episode. There was reportedly also an explosion on the Trans-Siberian pipeline because of this dead-end technology transfer. And it's quite possible that information from the Farewell dossier about what the Soviets were looking for is used by CIA technicians as they prepare fake science for this operation in the Philippines against the GRU.
Now, the aim here is to tie up resources and spread uncertainty inside a system that became increasingly reliant on stealing tech to try to keep up. So it really fits that when Kit Bennetts is talking to his Soviet contact, that they would have to take it seriously. It's worked for them in the past, so they do know it's feasible. People in the West will exchange secrets for money.
And the Soviets are increasingly desperate because these old sources have been blown and they need to get new ones.
Now, in the next episode, we'll look at how one American at the heart of the CIA's Soviet program was on the Soviet payroll from 1985, passing secret information to the KGB. For now, let's remember that while we have had a second source until this point, from here on, we are having to take the word of Kit Bennetts. We have every reason to think he's telling it straight. There may be slight errors around memory, as you'd expect, but this idea of money being part of the equation, it really does seem to make sense here. In any case, as he comes to the end of his involvement in the operation, Kit Bennetts brings in a new man to take over. He tells Vladimir this guy can give him better information about the technical aspects of combat aircraft.
And then we wheeled him in, my close friend who I'd never met before. And, you know, we got together and met and chatted, and, you know, we got my story straight and his story straight, and then he took over and I peeled off.
Yeah. And you never saw Vladimir again?
No. And in fact, our final meeting was clearly a final meeting for both of us. It was kind of, we both knew that we were closing. And so, you know, you never know whether or not they were onto us, but they kept going. So they kept going in the hope that they were onto something. But it was the end. I knew it was the end, and I was gone. So I didn't get the glory of recruiting someone.
And how did you feel? Do you remember, kind of walking away from all that? Do you remember how you felt?
Yeah, in an odd way, I was sad because I liked the guy. We enjoyed each other's company, and I liked the guy, so I was there to do a job. And I guess the disappointment that I didn't do the real starry thing to recruit a Soviet. You know, that's the real-time James Bond stuff. You know, if you talk about the sexy spying stuff, people think of the James Bond, the fast cars, but really, in the real game, the sexy stuff is recruiting someone in place and then having them run back and working for you. And because I didn't get to do that, I was cut out. You know, and that's, but I knew that though. I mean, that's what we did. That was the job. And no complaints about that, just, you know, but it was sad that I didn't see him again, you know, like I would love to know what happened in his life, and I just hope it isn't tragic.
We'll come back to what happened to Vladimir, but in the meantime, it's important for Kit Bennetts and the CIA man, his close friend that he's never met before, to push the story on to the next level.
So they organise to meet and get their stories straight in a way that corresponds with their covers. So drinking in the flesh pots of Manila.
We made arrangements for him to meet me in a bar, a place called the Kangaroo Club, which is where lots of Australians. There was lots of activities occurred up at Angeles. You know, as you can imagine, the city ringing in US Air Force Base. So people went up there to shows and things that were not necessarily cultural. And anyway, but this guy was going to meet me. And so I had this time that he was going to meet me and an alternate. So if he didn't show up or I didn't show up, we had an alternate, which is 2 hours later, somewhere else.
This is standard practice for intelligence officers. If they have a feeling they're being followed or their spider senses are off or whatever, they can break off the first meet and go to the second.
But of course, they might not make the first meet because something's gone seriously wrong and they've been picked up or even replaced by someone from the other side.
And if you're a knock who's been warned that your operation might have been compromised, that the GRU have killed another guy in a similar situation in Europe, so you're already feeling jittery out there on your own in the hinterland of Manila, and your collaborator doesn't show at the first meet, that could be a long couple of hours waiting for the alternate.
So anyway, he didn't show at the first meeting, and it always makes you a little bit nervous, you know, well, maybe he got held up, maybe whatever. And when I met him at the second meeting, he said to me, I make it a habit never to make the first meeting. And I thought, you wanker, you know, I just, really, you know, that's you've been reading too many spy books. You do the job. If you don't make the first meeting, there should be a reason for it, not, you know, hey, as a matter of course. But he was different to most of them. You know, most of the guys I dealt with were hugely professional.
Even then, this prolonged dance with Vladimir and the other operations he was running was clearly beginning to take a toll on Kit Bennetts and his own relationships, particularly with his wife.
Yeah, this is yet another instance of Kit Bennetts having to arrange the truth in such a way that it would hopefully work for him. He was allowed to tell his wife some of what he was doing, but he couldn't share much of his work with her. Bluntly, she didn't have the security clearance, so she didn't need to know.
What does it do psychologically to be playing a double game like that?
I think it comes and gets you. I mean, I really like Vladimir. I really liked him. He was a really nice guy. His wife was lovely. He was a good bloke. And all he was doing was what I was doing, only for the other side. I mean, I liked him. And yeah, it's deceptive. But that's the name of the game, I think.
So you can treat it a little bit like a sport. Like you go on the rugby field, you're playing this guy.
Yeah.
And you know it's kind of a game. Is that how you compartmentalise it in your head?
I wonder.
What's it like returning to a real relationship after your mind's had to do that? Like, is it...
Yeah.
Is it a difficult sort of thing to...
Well, in my case, it certainly was, because, you know, it was major in costing me a marriage.
Was it that sort of psychological separation?
Probably, yeah. I think I was... There's no doubt that I was a little damaged by it all.
As he says, ultimately, that would lead to his marriage breaking up. When it comes to his relationship with Vladimir, he'd like to keep thinking about that in a positive way.
And I go right back to that sales training I had. You know, people buy from people they like. Why did Vladimir and I get on well together? Because we liked each other. Deception as it was, we liked each other. And I tried to recruit him and he tried to recruit me, and it was like Mad Magazine, you know, spy versus spy. It was kind of, when I think about it now, probably a bit like that. But you had to like each other to be able to keep the relationship going. But then I suppose that's when your guard drops. I don't know, but yeah.
Would you like for us to try and find out about Vladimir, or would you go?
No, I don't. I don't actually want to. I don't think I want to know. There are a couple of options. One, they got onto the operation. They probably, maybe they got, once they started checking back into me, maybe the guy that I piggybacked in wasn't successful, no matter how hard he tried. Maybe he was successful, and maybe they wasted a lot of time and effort on it. Would they necessarily blame Vladimir? You know, it's the luck of the draw. It's the sort of thing that happened. However, you know, maybe his vulnerabilities were identified by Hansen, or more likely by Ames, and he might have gotten the shit. I don't know. I don't want to know. I don't want to know.
Right, you'd rather not know.
Rather not know.
This is the moment when the penny drops for Guyon and me. Not just that we don't know what happened to Vladimir, but that for 40 years, Kit Bennetts has had to live with a heavy uncertainty.
Before that moment of silence between the three of us, Kit Bennetts mentioned two names.
You know, maybe his vulnerabilities were identified by Hansen, or more likely by Ames.
He's talking about Aldrich Ames of the CIA and Robert Hansen from the FBI. These two men, it was discovered after the Cold War ended, were both passing information to the Soviets from the mid-1980s, including names of people working for CIA, and a number of these people were arrested and subsequently shot.
The brutal truth is that if the operation was successful, if the guy Kit Bennetts had handed off to had managed to get the GRU entangled in a messy program revolving around dead-end technology, or even the best prize, he'd managed to recruit him in place, within a year or two, the Soviets almost definitely found out about it through a fellow CIA officer who was selling secrets to the KGB.
So while we don't know what happened to Vladimir, there's a good chance it was something bad. The Agency was produced, written and hosted by John Daniel and me, Guyon Espinham. Our executive producer for RNZ was John Hartevelt, and our executive producer for Bird of Paradise Productions was Noel McCarthy.
Original music by Anthony Tonnen, graphic design by Oliver Wall. For RNZ, sound production and final mix was by Mark Chesterman. Production coordinator was Brianna Uritich-Grieg. Thanks to Steve Burridge, Ali Marsden, Jeremy Ansell and William Saunders. Thanks to Megan Whelan, and thanks also to Susan Baldacci.
The visual director at RNZ was Cole Eastham Farrelly, and our camera operator was Jess Charlton. Thanks also to Sarah Gaetanos for the article about Bill Such that appears on rnz.co.nz.
Thanks also to CNN, TVNZ, BBC, the ABC, Universal and Paramount. To read more about the documents and articles we've mentioned, you can go to rnz.co.nz/the agency, and you can see the links in the show notes.